Hello. It is now Easter, and I wanted to say a few words about that in a pagan history perspective sort of way. In Norway, we call Easter påske, and påske is directly derived from the Hebrew Pesach and the Aramaic Pascha, meaning Passover. And most of the celebrations in Norway are Christian in origin, of course. In my family, however, we completely failed we completely failed all the Christian aspects, basically. But we did something that was and still is rather common in Norway, at least during Easter, if one has access to a cottage in the mountains. So my murmur and murfar, my maternal grandparents, they were among the many of their generation in Norway who constructed a mountain cottage back in the 1950s. And they used it for holidays, of course, but it was also a way of learning skills. So for as long as I was a child back in the 70s and 80s, going to the cottage meant that we learned how to empty the dritaren, which means the shitter, as in the outdoor toilet. And we also learned the way more popular getting water from the well and heating it on the stove in order to get clean or for other washing purposes. We learned taking down trees and cutting and collecting timber. And we also learned how to dig the cottage out of snow, because sometimes meters of snow would completely cover the cottage and we would have to dig it out, even sometimes starting by digging out the roof. We also learned cooking in slightly old-fashioned ways, and we learned how to get clean with just a small bucket of water each, heated on the stove. And well, getting water was such a job, and heating water was such a job that we took turns every day who was allowed to clean off their sweat after a skiing trip and who had to marinate in their own perspiration for another day or two. And even more importantly, we learned everything you need to know when you go cross-country skiing in the mountains, which can be potentially very dangerous, especially in Easter time, actually, because there are a lot of avalanches in this period of time, because it's closing into spring. So we learned how to walk up skiing paths by ourselves. Well, to be fair, usually the strongest man in the family would be walking up the paths for skiing, and the rest of us would follow, so gliding more easily behind them. But we learned how to do it and how to find our way, and we also learned how to dig ourselves down for protection if there was a storm, although we fortunately never had to use this knowledge, so we didn't use our spades that we brought for skiing for any other thing than making snow seats and tables and little snow caves with several tunnels and rooms. It was a lot of fun. So at the Easter holidays, we would gather 1 or 2 or 3 family units, so that there were my parents and my brother and uncles and aunts and cousins, basically, all sharing a relatively small space for about a week or so. We would, of course, decorate the cottage inside with Easter symbols, such as hare symbols and egg symbols, and also a lot of chicken symbols, chicken themes. We also had candles and napkins and tablecloths that had to be yellow for this period. And on Easter morning, we children would get up to search for Easter eggs that the Easter chicken, the påskehøna, had left out for us. And this egg was filled with candy, and it was hidden very well, and we had to look for it. And whenever we came close to finding the egg, the Easter chicken, my mom, would cluck loudly. So she would go, if you were far away from the egg that you were searching for, she would go, and you get a bit closer and she goes, and you get really close and you go, okay, so that's that's how we celebrated Easter morning. And we went skiing every day, unless there was a big storm or something. And after every skiing trip, we children would be playing in the snow while the adults sat down in outdoor seats with a cup of coffee and a glass of wine, of course, skål. And they would be facing the sun and basically sun worshipping. And they refer to this sun, this particular sun at this particular time of year, as the påskesola, the Easter sun. And it is very strong and very effective for getting an awesome facial tan, which was probably the goal, but also just after a long winter, feeling the sun warming you. Because you have sun in the winter too, but it doesn't really warm you. So yeah, so that we do after, that was our after skiing time. And when it got dark, we would go inside and lit a fire and sit around the fire, and then we would gather around the table to eat, of course, and play games. And that would be about everyday work, skiing, relaxing. I have so good memories from Easter time, but it wasn't very religious in any way. The most religious thing we had was the worship of the påskesola, the Easter sun, and the worship of the Easter chicken, who was incidentally my mom. Well, as you may have gathered, our family Easter tradition were not particularly religious or ritual. So although I believe that both the Easter sun and the Easter chicken were mystical and mythical beings, and very much highly regarded by all. So, Easter. In English, you call this seasonal celebration Easter. And Easter is called Easter by the English-speaking Christians, but unlike the Norwegian word påske, the English name for this holiday itself does not have a Christian origin. The name Easter derives from a pre-Christian celebration, and we actually know very little about it apart from that fact, the word itself. I know that many pagans today, from various traditions, do celebrate Ostara or Eostre, but you also may know that when I teach something, I'm not teaching about modern day practices, and neither am I teaching from a position about what I think about anyone else's way of celebrating. Enjoy your celebrations, make your own celebrations. I'm not here to discuss or in any way judge whatever reconstructions have been made in order to have a good and meaningful time. I'm here to talk about the historical sources that we have to pagan celebrations and practices. And when it comes to Easter, the sources are extremely sparse. First of all, as far as I can tell, there are no Scandinavian sources at all. That there was some form of spring celebration is, however, extremely likely. So according to some scholars, like Dr. Rune Jarne Rasmussen in the Nordic Animist Calendar, very good book, according to him, it was the Disablot which took place in Scandinavia as a spring celebration. And it was likely held on the first full moon after the spring equinox, or else during the third full moon of the year. And this year that would have been very recently, on the 28th of March, or 29th. I have already spoken about the Disablot in a previous talk, which is available both on my Patreon and on my YouTube, because I made that one public. And I talked about how the sources vary a bit as to exactly when the Disablot took place. But generally, the sources suggest late winter or early spring. And I personally agree with Dr. Rune that this third full moon of the year, and in connection to the vernal equinox, is likely to be correct. So after making that talk, I had some comments which showed me that there is some confusion going on out there, mixing up the autumn alfablot and völsablot celebrations with the disablot. So let me be absolutely clear. There were celebrations going on during autumn, of course, and these involved alfablot and very likely also the völsablot. And whether these two celebrations had something to do with each other, we cannot know for certain either. But we do know that the disablot happened either in late winter or early spring, and that it was a great public celebration involving royalty and all. While the autumn celebrations of the elves and the horse thingies were different and more homebound. Now, the sources we do have about these autumn rites suggest family celebrations at home. While the disablot suggests great public rituals. As to other possible Scandinavian spring celebrations, we do not know. The disablot is our most probable guess. So as said, I already made a video about that and will put the link up in this description to this video. So, since I already talked about the disablot, which we know happened in Scandinavia during the Viking Age, let us turn our attention back to the pagan origins of the word Easter. When Googling, I see that there seems to be a lot of information out there, but when it comes to historical sources, we have only one that is certain. The rest of the information consists of later discussions of linguistic and etymological origins to the word and some other aspects that I'm going to talk about. And these may give us some hints. We have some place names and old goddess names, which suggest that this goddess, Eostre, existed for real. Now, none of these sources derive from the Nordic lands, but two ancient cultures that were linguistically, culturally, and religiously related, mainly from what we today know as England and Germany. So, let us begin with our one single source that we actually do have, the Venerable Bede. So, Bede was an Englishman or something, Anglo-Saxon. He was born sometime around the year 672 and died for certain in 735 AD. He was an Anglo-Saxon monk and a chronicler and a historian. And his works are of great value as sources because he was what we could call a time witness. He described things that were known back then, that were in fact before the Viking Age, and during a time when old pagan Anglo-Saxon traditions were still a very fresh memory. He wrote, among other books, a book called The Reckoning of Time, or in Latin, The Temporum Ratione. And this book is an Anglo-Saxon era treatise written in medieval Latin, and it attempts to explain ancient calendars, and not just the Christian kinds of calendars. Bede includes old pre-Christian Roman, Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, and Anglo-Saxon calendars in his work. And in this book, he writes a few lines about ancient Easter traditions of the pagan Anglo-Saxons. He writes that they call it Eostre in the Old English language, and he said that it was held during a month they refer to as Eostermånad, and which means the Easter month, and is the equivalent of April to us. And it was held in honor, this is what Bede says, it was held in honor of a goddess called Eostre. And by the time Bede writes this, he could testify that the now Christianized Anglo-Saxons had replaced this celebration with Christian Pasqua, but that they still called it after the old goddess and the old celebration, Eostre, which has led to Easter later. Now, there is absolutely no reason to think that Bede lied or was wrong about this. After all, he was writing for his peers, the educated men of the 8th century in England, and they would have known, of course, if it was an invention. He couldn't just write this and get away with it. So what he writes is probably accurate. Our only problem is that we have no other actual historical sources to this celebration. And so we know very little about it. But if not the celebration, what about the goddess Eostre? do we have any evidence of her existence? Ja, det har jeg. Again, very little. But we do have some Iron Age shrines dedicated to the Matronae Austriaceniae, the Eostre mothers, and these appear to be linguistically connected to Old English Eostre. We have found more than 150 such shrines, so these Easter mothers must have been very important at some point. Also, in medieval Germany, there was a festival called Ostarun, or Östarun, held during a month called Östarmanoth, and this has given name to the German word for Easter, Ostern. We also have one Frankish source from the age of Charlemagne, which would be the early Viking Age, in which we hear that the Easter month was Ostarmanoth, which means Easter month. So additionally, linguists have been able to successfully identify the name Eostre. Sorry, I'm being interrupted here. Cats, birds. That's how it should be. Hey, please. Yeah, good. Yeah. Okay. Additionally, linguists have been able to successfully identify the name Eostre as etymologically linked to many other goddess names, including the a Vedic goddess Ushas, a goddess of dawn, and Eos, a goddess of dawn, and Aurora, the Roman goddess of, yes, you guessed right, dawn. So she too was a goddess of dawn. And I think that dawn can mean so much more than just dawn. It can mean new light in every sense of the expression. It could be a spiritual, metaphysical, or just directly the new light that we are celebrating. And it could mean a new year, it could mean resurrection from death, it could mean the emergence of the sun goddess, and it could just be a symbol of the spring itself, the dawn of the year. There are also quite a lot of place names in England and Germany which could suggest places of veneration to the goddess Eostre. And the name also appears in some old German names. All in all, I think it's more than sufficient evidence for the existence of such a goddess at some point, associated to springtime. That people had goddesses with celebrations associated to springtime is something we must expect to find all over the world, and we do. And as far as England and Germany goes, we also have the name of the celebration and of the goddess herself. The rest, however, is pure speculation and reconstruction, and maybe just how we feel about things. Maybe. I got the cat here. So, okay, where was I? The people had goddesses. That people had goddesses with celebrations associated to springtime. That's what I said. It's something we find, of course, all over the world. And as far as England and Germany goes, we also have name for the celebration and of the goddess herself. So yeah, the rest is speculation and reconstruction, and maybe just how we feel about things, but speculate and reconstruct we can. And I'm not just talking about modern pagans, I am in fact also talking about academics, linguists and other scholars who have been doing it for quite some time. So, back in the early 1800s, the German brothers Grimm went around the German countryside and gathered stories and fairy tales. They claimed to have found stories and celebrations suggesting an ancient tradition of celebrating a goddess called Ostara, who would be the linguistic equivalent of Eostre. And the brothers Grimm did not provide sources other than tales that they claimed to have heard. Again, I cannot see really why they would have lied about this, but the evidence is still lacking, apart from the Grimm brothers' claim. And they made a lot out of this. They wrote lots and lots about the goddess Ostara without actually having being able to document or educate or provide enough evidence for it. So they have been widely criticized to some point that some people have actually refused the existence of Eostre and Ostara, but that is going too far. We do have linguistic and also some other evidence for a goddess called Eostre being celebrated in the spring, at least in the continent, like the Germany, England, France areas during pre-Christian times. Ostara, by the way, the reconstructed goddess, Ostara is a reconstructed name by linguists, basically by Brothers Grimm. But Ostara would be the Old High German version of Old English Eostre, so it's the same goddess. And by way of linguistic reconstruction, they have traced her back to a possible goddess who may have been called Austron in Proto-Germanic, and from then back to a possible Proto-Indo-European goddess of dawn called Husus. Goddesses of dawn are very common in the ancient world, so I think this is entirely possible, although we have no hard evidence for it. But what about all the symbols that are clearly that we think may be clearly not Christian in origin, like the Easter hare, the Easter eggs, and in my family at least, the Easter chicken. And what is this claim about the goddess Ishtar? Let's see. Yeah, Ishtar. For many years, a meme has been passed around on social media claiming that Easter comes from the goddess Ishtar from Sumer or Mesopotamia. According to this meme, Ishtar's name is pronounced exactly like Easter and is identical and was a goddess of spring, sex and fertility, and her symbols were the egg and the hare. All that is bollocks, to speak plainly. Yeah, she agrees. First of all, there is no linguistic connection between the name Ishtar and the name Eostre. The only thing these two clearly have in common is their divine status. We do not know if the hare and the eggs were associated with Eostre or Ostara. These symbols may have been brought in by the church, since we find no evidence for any other origin, and even if they existed in pre-Christian Europe, they may have been symbols of spring and new life and winter in general. They are quite obvious symbols. The hare, they can get pregnant while being pregnant. And eggs, obviously, obvious symbols of spring, new life. Yeah, it is possible that eggs were being decorated for spring celebrations. Completely possible, and we do know that that eggs were being decorated for spring celebrations in old pre-Islamic Iraq, which is where Mesopotamia and Sumer once lied. But these are not symbols of the goddess Ishtar. This meme says that she is symbolized by the eggs and the hare, and it just isn't not correct. Ishtar is symbolized by the lion and the star is identified in text as the planet Venus. So when you see a symbol of Ishtar, you will see her usually with a lion or with lions, or just symbolized as a lion, or with a star or as a star. Also Eostre is obviously a spring goddess in some way or other. It's obvious that she seems to be associated mainly to spring celebrations among Iron Age to medieval Germanic peoples on the continent, while the Mesopotamian Ishtar goes back thousands and thousands and thousands of years. It's one of the oldest written evidence we have for goddess worship is Ishtar and Astarte and Inanna. They are identified with each other also by the people who worship them, so they are the same. Also, Ishtar is not a spring goddess. She is a great goddess. She's the ruler of war, of order, of civilization. She's the inventor of all the things that made civilizations. She's also with sexuality and fertility, yes, but it's much wider. Ishtar is a great goddess. She rules all aspects of life, every aspect of life. She's symbolized by the lion and the stars. So she's not just a spring goddess, and her name has nothing to do with Eostre. really. So yes, spring celebrations did obviously happen in Mesopotamia too. Also the painting of eggs. So these are very widespread, obviously. And so Eostre will have counterparts in other traditions, of course. Any seasonal deity will have counterparts in other traditions. It doesn't mean that they are directly related, that the name, that they, for example, share name. They don't. Ishtar does not share her name with Eostre. Now, the decorated eggs as a spring symbol is found all over Europe. And it's also found all over North Africa, and it's all found all over the Middle East, and it goes back thousands and thousands of years. And early on, decorated eggs for Easter became an important Christian symbol. Yes, indeed. The painted eggs that we associate with Easter may be of Middle Eastern origin and brought into Europe with Christianity. It could have been here from before too, but as far as the pagan Eostre is concerned, we do not know if she too was associated to such eggs, or if these Easter symbols came into Western Europe via the church on a later stage. That is entirely possible. And as to the Easter hare, the Easter hare is only testified from the late 17th century and may have older roots, of course, and may have roots in Greek mythology. The brothers Grimm, however, claimed that it was associated with the goddess Ostara. But this too, they haven't been able to, they were not able to actually prove this. So it is speculation. We have no evidence for it. I personally like the idea of Eostre going around with hares. Hares are symbols of fertility and new life. Just by looking at them, they are perfect for spring symbolism. We also know that medieval people regarded hares very highly, and that there were often taboos about eating them, and they're often depicted as scary and very intelligent. So all these traditions do suggest some sort of sacred animal concept reaching back in time, but we do not know actually if when the hare became an important symbol of Easter, or whether it was actually connected to old Eostre. Could certainly be, but again, we do not know. So, some of you may be a bit disappointed. You may have wanted something more certain, a lot more information, but this is the great obstacle in historical studies. This is the fact. We are left with only a few pieces of the puzzle, and sometimes the pieces are so few and come from so many different places that we are left with guesswork. We have no actual old references to myths, to connections between symbols and celebrations in this case. The only thing we know is that there probably was a goddess back in the old days whose name was associated with the modern English word for Easter and the German Ostern. And she probably had to do with spring celebrations, and she may have an old Indo-European origin in a goddess of dawn and spring, and she also has a lot of counterparts around the world, because wherever there is a harsh winter, spring would be celebrated. I can promise you that. We celebrate spring all spring. So, however you feel like celebrating Easter, spring, or Ostara, or Pascha for that matter, I wish you a happy celebration and holiday. Thank you.
Sit with me as you are, if you and I could fly like a butterfly.
skal bli noen korømt jammer, det to, da. Bli noen korømt jammer. Der får vi riktig kor.
Ja.